Because there's another way to conceive of it, right? The distribution of income upwards would be the creation of more monopolies. More concentration of capital, so that rather than having a lot of middle-class capitalists or petit bourgeois companies who had a few big corporations, and that would also distribute money upwards into fewer and fewer hands. When I got started reading,
here's confession of your petty bourgeois perspective, Doug. You're like, monopoly destroyed the smaller capitalists.
I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that happened. Well, it is the Cutronezone again. This is the last Marxist, Chris Cutrone. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about Trump. You wrote an essay years ago, 2016, Why Not Trump? Then you wrote, Why Not Trump Again? And then you wrote, you wrote Why I Wish Hillary Clinton Had Won. And then you wrote Why Not Trump Again? And now you've written Why Not Trump Again, or Again with Trump, or something like, what's the title?
Why Not Trump Again?
That's right. Okay.
I added a comma. Right. Why not Trump again?
That's right. Having read all of those essays, this one strikes me as markedly different from the other three. And there's a seriousness to this essay that was, not in your initial essay, although people took it seriously, but you were being playful and critical in your first essay, Why Not Trump? And now there's a defense of Trump and Why Not Trump Again, which I just wasn't present in the other two. So I thought we'd start there. Like, what is it about this moment for Trump that is different from the other two times that you playfully suggested we might consider Trump?
That's right. So, I think that there's been a kind of an evolution in the way I've written about Trump, in the way that, the rhetorical question, why not Trump? The implication being, because you want the Democrats, right? And then, why I wish Hillary had won, meaning, okay, maybe it would have been better if people had gotten what they wanted, because they were protesting against him. They were protesting against her, but they forgot about that. And they were protesting against him. And then the 2020 article, Why Not Trump Again, for a second time, that I used Kanye West as the device. And that already was moving in a more serious direction, in the sense of, okay, Trump is going to be running before COVID. The plan was that he was going to run touting his prison reform. And he did try to maintain that, right? That was in the Republican National Convention of 2020. He had a parade of freed prisoners testifying to how great it was that he had let them go. The First Step Act. Even in the midst of COVID, he tried to maintain that. And I brought up at that time already what was incipient, the cancel culture. I think that I said something like the Democrats, Trump wants to let people out of jail to give them a job, but the Democrats just want to get you fired and put you in prison. Right? And obviously stakes are higher now on that front, aren't they? Right? The cancellation has only ratcheted up. It's not like it's eased under Biden. It hasn't.
No.
Right? It's intensified. And it's, of course, COVID, so with COVID came a new kind of imperative to cancel people and to penalize all sorts of things. And, so this was, what I'm taking on is the lawfare now. And maybe people will not see a connection between the lawfare and the abrogation of civil liberties. And that's why the center of this article is really about how criminal trials are inherently about civil liberties, actually.
Mhm.
Right. And something that we talked about in the fall and, starting maybe last summer, you and I have had two main themes in the
Mhm.
Cutronezone podcasts. One was civil liberties and lawfare and, these kind of basic kind of bourgeois right. And then the other, of course, after October 7th was Israel-Palestine. But I think that it's been a kind of a sub-theme for us. So I wrote my Israel-Palestine article out of our podcasts, kind of greatest hits of our podcasts.
Mhm.
And I wrote this article, also greatest hits of what we've talked about in terms of civil liberties and lawfare.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I just want to point out the obvious, which is that lawfare has to be connected to the question of civil liberties, given that our civil rights are spelled out in the Constitution, and one of them is the Fifth Amendment, right, which is that we're protected from the state. We have to be tried in front of a jury of our peers. We have to have due process of law. We're protected from. I'm just looking at it right now. Self-incrimination. And we are protected from double jeopardy, which, by the way, in some states, nations, you're not.
No, in many nations, you're not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just can't imagine. Yeah. What would it be like to, I think I found out that in the UK, maybe, I forget which. Yeah. It's like oh no, we didn't get the prosecution didn't get the result it wanted. So they're trying again. It's like, that's just.
Basically speaking, everywhere but the United States, things are stacked in favor of the state. In the United States, they're stacked in favor of the defendant, the accused, which means they're stacked in favor of civil rights, civil liberties, society, as opposed to the state.
Right.
Jury trials are also not popular outside the United States.
Yes. They think of that as barbaric.
Yeah, so it's usually the judge decides. Or there might be a judicial panel. There might be like 3 judges that decide. And the other thing, because I get into this a lot, the divided government, the 3 branches of government being present in a trial, right? So in other countries, the judicial branch is part of the executive branch. So the most you might have is executive, including judicial, versus legislature. But here it's 3. And I think 3 is a magic number, right? In other words, with 3, you really get a counterbalance that you don't actually get with just 2. And of course, so you mentioned the UK, a lot of countries have really a combination of executive and legislative, meaning the prime minister represents a legislative majority. And of course, with Trump, the big issue that's coming up is presidential immunity. Right. And the whole point of the separation of the executive from the legislative is that the American revolutionaries, the founding fathers, they didn't want a parliamentary system. They didn't want the executive to be identical with the legislature. Right. So divided government, which causes people all sorts of headaches in the United States, is actually built in to the American system, meaning that the legislature is separate from the executive. And they weren't thinking of political parties back then, but still it would apply that you'd have a different legislative parliamentary majority from the executive. And that's really essential. It's really very essential. And the final point is, maybe to bring up a kind of more controversial issue, is that maybe we should listen to the Republicans and the Federalist Society and these people, the unitary executive theory, that maybe the post-Nixon, the post-Watergate reforms were not a good idea. Which means that basically the president has been removed as the chief law enforcement officer. So the president remains the commander-in-chief of the military, but he's no longer in the same position. There's a tension there. So the kind of independence of the Department of Justice from the president that was established after Nixon, after Watergate, might be a real problem that we should not take for granted.
What is the problem there? Because I understand I sometimes wear a shirt that says Nixon now more than ever.
Right.
And I wear it ironically. Semi-ironically, I have mixed emotions, mixed feelings, mixed thoughts about Nixon. Like, that on the one hand, the easiest way to explain why I might wear that shirt is to say, well, he's the last New Deal Democrat.
Right.
So, that was a way to support Bernie Sanders, to wear Nixon now more than ever, because Bernie Sanders would be a return to the Nixonian era in that way.
The expansion of the Great Society, the expansion of the New Deal. The last major expansion of that happened under Nixon.
Right. So there's that. But there's also the fact that I think the Watergate scandal ultimately happened at the behest of the deep state. I do believe. Yeah. I mean, I think that the crimes that he committed were real. They were themselves violations of the Constitution in some way. Yeah. But they were certainly dirty. There are a lot of dirty tricks.
Definitely dirty tricks. But he didn't invent dirty tricks.
No, I'm not saying he did.
LBJ wiretapped MLK.
Right.
And MLK was assassinated under LBJ.
Right. My father's a boomer. And my mother came from a Republican family, and he was a Democrat. So I got to witness arguments around Nixon at the time, and more than that, I got to hear them replayed from his memory.
You would rehash old arguments that they had.
Yes, that's right. And he would say, these people who support Nixon, they would say, well, everybody does it. And it's like, that does not mean that it's acceptable or right.
So I've added some things to my draft that may not have been in there when I sent it to you. I've basically spelled out more about, I think that it's already in there, like that Nixon thought that if the president does it, it's not illegal.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that I added the 1960 election, which is, they stole it fair and square.
Right.
Meaning the Democrats did steal the election from Nixon in 1960, but he chose not to challenge it because, as he understood it, they stole it fair and square, meaning they stole it according to the rules. Right. And that to challenge it would have shown how rotten the system is. And of course, so he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to undermine confidence in the system by exposing it. And whereas that's the sin that Trump has committed, meaning he's willing to peel back the scab and show the infection underneath. That elections are hinky in the United States. I mean, they're hinky everywhere, but they're hinky in the United States especially because, as you and I know from the 2000 election, elections are conducted at the state level and every county decides on the method. So come on, obviously think about government at the county level. That is like the definition of corruption.
Yeah.
At the state level too. I mean, I'm here, I've lived 30 years in Chicago, and I think 3 out of 4 of our governors have gone to jail.
Wow.
Yeah, they've all gone to jail basically. It's quite remarkable. And I'm always reminded, there's just a fertile field of this in Chicago and in Illinois. Foucault's famous statement, which is that the path to power leads to either prison or politics, often both.
So, okay, but just to zoom in on this idea about the power of the executive, which you were raising, and Nixon in particular, I think that a reflexive position would be that even if it is common and the level of corruption is not unique in the case of Trump or Nixon, that nonetheless the rule of law, and if you take a civics test, by the way, the rule is that everyone has to live under the law and obey the law. It's not that some people don't. It's not if you're the president, you don't have to.
Right.
So therefore, if he's found to have violated the law, he should be punished within the limits of the law. Now, the problem with I think that there's something like 91 different counts against him,
and that doesn't include the civil lawsuits, right? But the criminal charges, criminal counts in 4 cases,
right? And of those cases, there's one about a bribe to a porn star. There's one about is that one of them? Or did I break up?
Yeah. Am I still here? Say again.
In one of the cases is about bribes to a porn star.
Oh yeah, Stormy Daniels.
Right. One of them is about about January 6th and the insurrection. And one of them is about that, but it's in the state of Georgia. Is that right? Is there
in the state of Georgia, the case is a RICO case, so a racketeering case, where he was trying to get local Republicans to challenge the election, and they ultimately did not. Right, they refused to. And then the 4th case is the Florida federal case, which is the classified documents case. So there are 2 federal cases. One is the DC case about the insurrection alleged, which of course it's not, and the other is the classified documents case in Florida because it's Mar-a-Lago where he kept the documents. So it's in the district that covers, it's in the federal district that covers Florida. And then there are 2 state cases, and that's the Georgia case about the pressing for a recount, and then the New York case, which is about filing false business records because the payoff to Stormy Daniels was not listed as a business expense or something.
Right. So I had forgotten about the stolen documents case. I mean,
that's the one, though. If you listen to Alan Dershowitz, that's the one that he's most likely to be convicted on, because it's a strict liability case, meaning they don't have to show criminal intent. They only have to show that he had the documents. Right. So you hear about military people who were sent to prison because they took a selfie on a submarine, like a sailor took a selfie on the submarine and sent it to his girlfriend, and so he wasn't spying, right? But they convicted him just by having done it. It doesn't matter why he did it, right?
Right.
He was not intending to reveal classified information, but he did, right? And so because it's a strict liability case, it's the easiest one to prove, right? And then it's compounded by the fact that he was told he had documents that he shouldn't have, and he refused to turn them over and tried to hide them, right? And so they don't have to prove that he had any criminal reason for doing so, just that he did so.
So the case that this amounts to lawfare hinges on a couple of different points. One would be that as the executive, he should have immunity. And that reads to a lot of people as that he should be above the law, right? And which is not what you would suggest should be the case if you've taken a basic civics test. Which, by the way, I've had fun lately wasting my time taking practice tests to see if I could qualify as a citizen in the United States.
Oh yeah, right. Right.
And I can. And I gave it to I gave Ashley a practice test on the last stream, and she passed. I put the thumb on the
Vivek Ramaswamy, right? He had proposed as a candidate for the presidential nomination for the Republican Party. He had proposed that Americans have to pass the same test that immigrants have to pass, or they can't vote until they're 25. Right. So if you want to vote before you're 25, you have to pass one of these tests, or you have to enroll in a like first responder kind of profession or in the military. So basically, if you're like police, fire department, nurse, emergency room doctor, if you're one of those people, then you get to vote when you're 18 or before you're 25. Or if you're in the military, you get to vote before you're 25, but otherwise you have to pass this test.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, so the idea being that it really isn't about excluding anyone from voting. It's rather about encouraging people to know these things.
Right. That's right. And I think that's a good idea. I don't know about making it connected to the vote, but like, how about if you want to run for office, you have to take the test? How about that? That would be...
Well, I mean, most, so this about politicians, right? So most of them are lawyers.
Right.
And they're usually trained in constitutional law. So people who are trained as lawyers who have an aspiration to politics, they usually study constitutional law, and that's what qualifies them to work the system, basically. So, obviously there are people who have other kinds of training, but a hell of a lot of lawyers in politics, and generally speaking, those lawyers are constitutional lawyers. That's
so they would pass.
They would definitely pass because, like I said, they're all interested in manipulating the system. In other words, it's not like they'd pass because they believe in it. It's not like civics in the sense of, okay, this is what we know and what we live by, what we believe in. They're trained to just regard it more cynically.
But okay, so do we have to believe that the reforms after Nixon were a mistake in order to see these indictments of Trump as an example of lawfare?
Okay, so a couple of different things. So basically, one of the things that I point out in my article is that it's all unprecedented. It's all novel legal theories and all unprecedented and untested applications of the law, all 91 charges. Mm-hmm. And most of the civil cases, I think all the civil lawsuits have this quality too. And that's not only because he was president, right? But because they're stretching the law in all these different ways. So that's, to me, what makes it lawfare. Like, let's say that he had never been president. Let's say that he was just a candidate. Because they're probably wishing that they had done this before 2016. Like, when they announced his candidacy, they probably should have thrown all this kind of stuff at him back then to keep him from becoming president at all. But on the presidential immunity point in particular, right? So basically there is parliamentary immunity, there's legislative immunity. So if you're a legislator, you have immunity. And if you're a judge, you have immunity. Now, why is that? Right? Meaning that to be prosecuted, you have to be removed from that status. You have to be impeached. In other words, the body that you're a part of has to vote to strip you of your immunity.
So if a judge commits murder, the first step is to impeach them from their role as a judge, and then you can try them.
That's right. And similarly with the legislature, I mean, all these things have been eroded over time. In other words, these kinds of immunities are core to the bourgeois revolution. So they come out of the bourgeois revolution in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. But then they've steadily eroded under capitalism. And the reason that they've steadily eroded is that, of course, the executive and the administrative aspect of the state has grown in importance, right? It's become more urgent to be able to prosecute people rather than, go through this process. So there are loopholes now. There are ways that they can, they're not even supposed to investigate. Like, in other words, Congress has to supposedly give approval for any of its members to even be investigated. Right? So, I mean, that's, of course, not really true in practice, but nominally, right? Because the way that I always like to put it is, well, of course, in the realm of politics, who would the police want to prosecute most of all? Politicians, right? In other words, because they're the people who can cause trouble. right? So, of course, the executive branch would be focused on the legislative branch in terms of investigation and prosecution, because how could they not if they're in constant political conflict, right? Wouldn't it just be kind of obvious? Oh, who are these people coming at me? I better come at them. And what do I have at my disposal? I have the executive branch. And because, it is one of the things that certainly the Republicans have brought up about Trump, which is that this is a Stalinist kind of Beria style prosecution. Show me the man and I'll find you the crime. Right. So the idea being that it's a fundamental injustice to target someone. In other words, you're supposed to, target the crime and then find the person responsible for it, rather than targeting the person and figuring out what they might be guilty of. Because it's understood that if any of us was investigated, there would probably be a chargeable offense that we've committed. No matter how minor.
No, not me.
I mean, I have a hard time imagining. It's one of these things, right? Like I have very simple taxes, right? We're in tax season. Very simple taxes. I'm just a working class person. I just have wages. But I kind of feel like, well, what if I were audited?
Oh my God.
Am I 100% certain that they're not going to find an error?
Right.
I mean, I tend to think that probably the errors I commit on my taxes are costing me, that I'm probably getting less of a refund than I deserve, etc. Right? But it's one of these things where, strictly speaking, probably we all are committing.
Oh, sure. I was kidding when I said not me. Yeah, no, and I remember when it was discovered that the NSA was spying on us all, and I would raise it to people, and they said, "Well, if you're not doing anything wrong, if you're not, breaking any laws, then what are you worried about?" And that's like, yeah,
like,
okay.
I mean, it's like jaywalking. Like, who gets a ticket, a citation for jaywalking? Well, you never do until the police have a reason to. In other words, if there's a protest. Yeah, right. And then they can get you for jaywalking, and it's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So again, why do these things exist? So the point being that the executive also has immunity, right? Not just the legislature and the judiciary, but the executive also has immunity, and it has immunity for the same reason that the other branches do, meaning to basically prevent law enforcement from being used as a political weapon. That's the reason, right? I had in my mind also, Ben Burgess had said something like he's in favor of prosecuting Trump because they all should be prosecuted. George W. Bush should be prosecuted, and Obama should be prosecuted, right? Like George W. Bush should be prosecuted for the Iraq War, and Obama should be prosecuted for the drone strikes. And it's like, no, maybe not everyone should be prosecuted. Maybe, as has been the case, and should still be the case, none of them should be prosecuted. Meaning, you want to get rid of Trump politically? Vote against him. That's it. Right? In other words, that this is in fact an end run around election, around the question of politics. Because they can get rid of any politician if they want to through criminal prosecution. So
what? Okay, so if I'm Ben Burgess and I say, look, if all of these criminals, George W. Bush, LBJ, Bill Clinton, they've all violated international law and our own nation's laws, right? I think when it comes to
international law is almost unenforceable. So,
but I just remember our own laws that are.
Obama killed an American citizen in Yemen.
Yeah, exactly. And there are right. So but I would just say like international law is often a reflection of U.S. law. There are things that are correlations.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. So yeah, the way to go after George W. Bush, say, for his war crimes, and I think he was a war criminal, is to have had him impeached. To have the political force and enough representatives and enough of the public committed to the idea that he should be impeached.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So impeachment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is impeachment? Because they have basically the House of Representatives does an impeachment process, and then the Senate votes on whether to convict or not.
Right.
But conviction only means removal from office. And what does removal from office mean? It means then you could be criminally prosecuted.
Right.
In other words, you have to be stripped of your immunity. And the only way to do that is through an impeachment and through a conviction and impeachment. And, that didn't happen with Trump. They impeached him twice. They didn't get a criminal conviction, if you will. They didn't get a removal from office conviction. And so he can't, be prosecuted for those things. Withholding, like he's not being charged with withholding congressionally approved arms transfers and funding to Ukraine, which is the first impeachment. And the second impeachment was, for a corrupt motive, right? So not just, he was implementing policy as he saw fit as the executive with regard to Ukraine, but because he was blackmailing the Ukrainians to give him dirt on Biden, right? So corrupt motive, that was key to their case. But it's also important that he was not impeached for insurrection in the January 6th matter, right? So he's never been charged with insurrection, right? Not even in the impeachment, right? They used the language of it, but that actually wasn't the basis of the impeachment. So, there's a lot of distinction between public rhetoric and actual legality. And, you would have to ask the point of, okay, George W. Bush is obviously out of office. So what would be the point of prosecuting him for war crimes? Well, to send a message that you don't want our presidents committing war crimes, I guess. That's the idea, right? It's as a warning and as a disincentive to future presidents. Okay.
But that's right. But it would have, I think for that to be the case, it would have had to happen pretty much immediately after he left office or before he left office. Yeah.
And similarly with Obama, right? So you'd want to prosecute him for the drone strike that killed the American citizen in Yemen. Teenage kid, right? Right. In order to say, we don't accept that. So why didn't they? Right? Why didn't they? Why wasn't that taken up by anybody? Right? It's because, as Trump points out, right, that would prevent the president from being the president. And it does go back to the Lockean principle of executive prerogative, right? So executive prerogative is that sometimes you have to break the law to preserve the law. And, this is going to raise hackles. It's going to sound like Carl Schmitt, state of emergency, justification for Hitler. Well, no, it's John Locke. It's a bourgeois revolutionary, and it's done in a revolutionary spirit, right? And it's about the executive having independence from the legislative branch, actually. And it is in the American context. So in the British context, it has to do with the monarchy, right? So the monarchy is there, and that's the permanent state, if you will. And then you have government, which is parliamentary government. So you have a parliamentary majority with the prime minister. So government is parliamentary, connected with the legislative. But then the executive is actually these people who are appointed by the king. And they're just there. In other words, they are the king's deputies, regardless of what the parliamentary majority is. Interesting, isn't it? And I think that we talked about this, why Hegel favored this form of government and state. Right? Basically a liberal, because that's what Locke is. John Locke is a classical liberal. He's not Hobbes. Hobbes was a conservative. Hobbes was a reactionary. Hobbes was an old-style monarchist. Whereas Locke is giving a kind of bourgeois justification to the monarchy that Hegel appreciated, and that the Americans took over to some degree in the U.S. Constitution. Right? which is, again, to separate. And with Hegel, it's also vexed by the issue of the bureaucracy. I don't know if you know this idea from the philosophy of right, that maybe the bureaucracy is the universal class, so to speak, because they're above all the conflicts in civil society. Like, in other words, they're just performing the duty of the state in a disinterested way. Right. And the point being that if you don't have that, then all the officers of government will come out of the interests of civil society. That they won't put the state above all the universal interests of the state above the particular interests of civil society. So the American system is different. And so it builds upon this bourgeois revolutionary conception, which is about the distinction between state and civil society, where basically you need them to counterbalance each other. So you need civil society against the state, and you also need the state against civil society, because otherwise you'll have private interest run amok. Right? Even the majority private interest is seen as too particular and a violation of the universal interest of society. It's a Rousseauian idea of the general will, that the general will of society transcends all the particular interests, even the majority interest, even the aggregate, like everyone's particular interests, still there's a general will that transcends that. Right? In other words, people have an interest in what they're doing that they themselves don't understand. Right, that very basic idea. So the American system takes it one step further, and the American system is more libertarian, we might say, than the British. Like, the model for Hegel was the British kind of constitutional monarchy and a kind of liberal monarchy, the Lockean idea, which means that you elect a monarch every 4 years. That's what it is. So there is a monarchy, but it's an elected monarchy. But there is a monarchy. The French system is somewhat similar, coming out of the French Revolution. I mean, obviously there was a lot of Sturm und Drang coming out of the French Revolution, but certainly, you know, if you look at the French Republic now, you know, the Fifth Republic, there is a president and there's a prime minister. So the prime minister represents the parliament. Right. So
you froze up for a second. Could you say that last bit again about the prime minister represents?
The parliamentary majority, and the president is independent of that. Right. So often you have a prime minister of a different party from the president in France. Right. In the Fifth Republic, in the more recent era. So again, the idea of the independence of the executive. Now, we've talked about this before, and certainly it's core to my understanding of the capitalist state, that the independence of the executive was first understood in this more civil libertarian way as a check and balance against majoritarianism. But in capitalism, it becomes something else. It becomes the Bonapartist character of the capitalist state, which is the need for executive action independent of the law as an emergency measure. But in capitalism, more and more has to be done under that rationale than was originally conceived in the bourgeois revolution. So in the bourgeois revolution, the idea was, yes, there might be emergencies that call for this, but they're going to be rare. Now it's constant.
Right.
And that's due to the nature of capitalism itself. Meaning, in capitalism, society can't take care of itself. It needs the state to take care of it.
Why is that? What is it about capitalism that makes it difficult for society, more difficult for society to take care of itself?
I mean, it's the bourgeois social relations are in contradiction and crisis in the industrial era. So when bourgeois social relations were kind of organic and spontaneous in character, then you didn't have these massive crises that we experience now, you know, from within society itself. So of course there were always crises, but those crises were external, they were extrinsic, they were wars, natural disasters, right? Whereas now the crises come from within the organic, spontaneous activity of society itself. They're not external to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, they're intrinsic, right? So
see, I would think of, when I think about the crisis within capitalism, I think of it, and this is, I think both a strength and a limitation of my way of thinking, as coming out of the economic crises, coming out of the cycle of business cycles and
absolutely,
and creating unemployment and poverty and things like that. And so that's because of the economy of capitalism creates poverty as well as wealth.
Yes,
it sets up contradictions.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. So that is like the clearest way of thinking about it. I raise it in my article. Police and prisons are inventions of the industrial era, which we're apt not to see that. We're apt to see, oh, didn't they lock people up in London Tower? And wasn't there the Sheriff of Nottingham and Robin Hood? No, those are not prisons or police the way we have prisons or police, because first of all, the only people who were imprisoned were aristocrats and priests. They didn't bother arresting and imprisoning peasants and even merchants. They just killed them. Right? Whereas now, right, yes, rich people do go to prison, but generally, what do we mean when we mean prison? We mean the proletariat. That's who's in prison, right?
Right.
And again, we didn't, law enforcement was basically an aristocratic largesse, meaning you were given a commission, Sheriff of Nottingham, and it's kind of like, do you know your kind of medieval history? So tax collectors for the king, right? They were incentivized to collect taxes because they could keep a cut. Right. So they weren't like civil servants, right? Like it wasn't bureaucratic, like it wasn't like this professional thing that we think of today. It was just obvious, it's rapacious, meaning the king's men are coming to take their taxes, meaning they're just pirates. They're just coming to steal from you, and they can do that because the king is powerful, right? And because the local lords are, in cahoots with him or whatever, right? Or they're not, right? In which case there's going to be a fight between the local lord and the king's tax collector. So it's not like the state, when we think of the state now, like people who's, and people, back then could be given a commission to collect taxes that could be revoked. You did it for a season, or you did it for, a couple of years. It wasn't like, okay, you're a lifelong police officer, you're a lifelong FBI agent, or you're a lifelong federal prosecutor, because that's what we're talking about, right? You're basically like back then you were like a favored aristocrat who, like, the king gives you a kind of a bonus, says, oh yeah, I'll give you the power to collect taxes in this area for a certain amount of time because I like you.
Right. And when you do that, you take 10% or 20%
exactly.
or whatever.
Right. And so whereas now, the state is supposed to serve a more rational function.
Right. This is why the detective is like a modern or industrial era figure in literatures, because it rose up along with the need for the police and this kind of society.
Yeah, that kind of professionalism. And so it's a curious phenomenon. But anyway, so we have, basically the Nixon post-Watergate reforms.
Let's talk about those. Yeah.
Are about, like, the president can't tell the career law enforcement and legal prosecutors what to do. Right? They are outside of his control. So yes, he can appoint a attorney general to run the Department of Justice. But then after his appointment of the attorney general, or her appointment of the attorney general, the president can't really interfere with the attorney general. It's sort of set apart from other cabinet positions this way. And then the attorney general has certain power, but not other power over the police and prosecutors under them. And then they do other things like a 10-year appointment to the FBI director, which is like the 10-year appointment to chairman of the Federal Reserve, meaning that you can ostensibly you can remove them, but you're not supposed to. Right. So the reason they get a 10-year term is that they're supposed to have a term that transcends any presidential term. Right. So anyway, now the FBI having a 10-year term, that's J. Edgar Hoover basically wrangled that from the presidents that he collected dirt on and blackmailed them. Right. So he's like, you can't fire me because but just in case you're thinking about it, you have to appoint me to a 10-year term. So that it would be like a thing if they tried to fire him, right? And I think the CIA director is something like that too, right? They're not supposed. They can be appointed if the term is up. It's like the Federal Reserve chair; they can be appointed by a president if their term is up, and they can ostensibly fire them, but they're really not supposed to, right?
So
now, why do we have a Federal Reserve chair running the economy, director of the CIA and director of the FBI, all serving beyond any presidential term?
Because the administrative state has its own interests as apart from.
Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. Society needs it. Society needs some continuity of executive power and administrative authority that transcends politics.
Yeah.
That transcends elections.
Okay. I mean, I don't like that. I don't like hearing
we
that.
shouldn't like it.
No, I
That's
don't like
why
that.
the right wing will run around. They're like, it all went to shit when the Federal Reserve was established. Like these kind of paranoid ideas. And it's like, yeah, but why was the Federal Reserve established? Why did we need that? It's not like, oh, it was established and now everything's gone to shit. It's like, no, we actually needed that. Capitalism. Right? That's always the answer. If you want to know, the answer is always capitalism. Right? Why do we have these things? Right? Instead, it becomes this mistake that was made. And, so it's not, if the state is interested, I mean, this is the paradox. The paradox is that all these civil servants, these FBI agents who were trying to get rid of Trump in 2016, Andrew McCabe and, these characters, Peter Strzok and his girlfriend, his adulterous girlfriend, I forget what her name was, and they were all texting each other and emailing each other about, we got to stop Trump and we're going to keep him out. And even if he comes in, we got a backup plan, right, to take care of him. Well, they think they're doing their civic duty, right? They think that they were acting in the best interests of society. Right? And that's the thing, right? So it's not like, oh, these people are self-interested. Well, they might be, but they really believe. We have to grant that they believe this, right? And that they think that there are certain functions that are too important to be interfered with by the whims of the electorate. And they might be right about that, Doug. They might be right about that, right?
Let me give you an example of something that you hear about, the blob. And I think that's also called like the DC consensus. It's a neoconservative consensus.
The Washington Swamp.
Right. The Atlantis Council or whatever, the Atlantic Council. Right. This is the interest. This is American foreign policy interests, and it's set by mostly kind of a bipartisan consensus within the administrative state. It's not,
and over a long period of time.
Over a long period of time.
And in cahoots with, or I should say, not in cahoots or collusion, in coordination with allies.
Right. Well, this is the thing. You hear Putin talk about how unreliable the Americans are and how they go back on things all the time. And you think to yourself, well, you get a whole new slate of leaders. You make an agreement with one guy, and he's replaced 2 years later by somebody else based on people not liking the agreement he made with you, for possibly. So this American democracy, and this is maybe
Here's an example of this. So Obama negotiated 2 controversial trade deals. One was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other had a similar acronym, but it was about Europe. And the U.S. insisted in both deals that the stipulations, the details of these deals could not be made public. So for other governments to sign on for it, they had to agree, we're not going to reveal. It's secret. Basically, it's a secret agreement that the U.S. was negotiating with Asian and European countries. And so why did the Obama administration insist upon that? Because they said, we don't want any of this to be fodder for political controversy, either in the United States or in Asia or Europe. So we want this kept completely out of the political realm. Right? Because I think that they actually said this. The people will not understand it. And therefore, we can't have it be demagogued. All right. There you have it. Trump ran against that. Not because he's not a demagogue. He is a demagogue, right? In other words, they were trying to prevent just what happened.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, you keep something secret and things go bad.
And it looks really bad. Or if it's just secret at all, people are like, why is it secret? Oh, you're saying we can't understand it? What do you mean we can't understand it? We can understand it. We can go on Wikipedia. We can understand it. I mean, obviously, we can't understand it. You know, the layperson can't understand these things. Definitely not.
I don't know.
I mean, the question is, what is there to understand? In other words, I'm not going to claim to understand. I'm just going to say, again, capitalism. They're trying to manage it. They're really trying to micromanage it, actually, in an amazing way. It ain't going to work out. Like, in other words, this is not going to go the way they think it's going to go, right? Because they're just like, if we just do this very carefully, and then they say, oh, Trump's coming in and tearing up these trade deals that took us 10 years to negotiate, right? So it's ongoing negotiation from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. It took us all this time to hammer this out, and we had to come to all these compromises and negotiated.
Really, from the first Bush administration through Clinton, you know, this was long-term. It wasn't, all the deals are different, but they're all kind of part of the same world order. Yes. Yeah. And
it's just, you know, the basic point is that that's all well and good. I get it. Right. Like you know, worked all these things out and you don't want people to mess with it, but it's not going to work. In other words, it's not going to do what you think you're trying to do.
Listen, I feel this is my naivete. Okay. But I feel, and also maybe my hubris, but I feel as though it is possible for everyday people to understand even the global economy on at least well enough.
If anyone were willing to talk about it, how much journalism is there on it?
There was for a little while after 2008. There were major motion pictures made about it that went through the trouble of explaining what a credit default swap was and what, you know, and made drama out of, you know, how good a loan was and the, you know, what's the A level and B level security.
You know, I always joke with my students about the newspaper, that old fashioned thing that doesn't exist anymore, right?
Right.
And how, like, there are 2 or 3 parts of the newspaper, right? There's like news.
Yep.
Then there's business news, and then there's sports news. The only actual information is in the business section.
Right.
Everything else is not information, it's rhetoric. Like, there is some information.
They sometimes call it like it is in sports.
Yeah, they might, because people are betting. Right? But generally speaking, like, you know, what is the actual reportage? What's the actual transmission of information? It's in the business section, because that's where things matter.
Right.
Right? And everything else is selling advertising. The business section is selling information.
Right.
The other parts of the newspaper are only selling advertising.
When I was a really serious political activist, like I was trying to stop the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I subscribed to the Financial Times because I wanted to know what was really going on.
That is the best stuff to read. In other words, The Economist, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the real news in terms of what's actually going on. No, but what I mean is, are we living in a public culture? I mean, people might be interested, but generally, are they prepared to, like what we were talking about, these trade deals?
Yeah.
Right? So it's easy to say, oh, people took an interest in things that failed. So there were these things like credit default swaps or whatever. And then people wanted to know, how the fuck did this happen? Oh, look at this crazy thing that they invented that failed. So we can talk about something after it's failed, sure. But in terms of like how things actually work, because that's just a small piece, right? That was the piece that was the Jenga piece that was removed and the whole thing came down. But
right. I think there's actually a scene with Jenga in the movie.
Right.
Short.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? But what about the rest of it? How that works? Nobody talks about that.
Well, it's all fine.
Yeah, it's all fine. It's all fine. Except I feel like, no, that Jenga piece that failed, actually it's the whole thing that failed.
Right.
And we just think it's the one little Jenga piece that failed. No, the whole thing failed, actually.
Right. Yeah. But anyway, one of the things as a socialist that I would like to see is for people to be engaged politically and theoretically with the world, so that they want to understand it to the best of their individual ability, and maybe to improve their individual ability as in the process, because they think they can change it. Because they think through that they can change it.
I mean, generally speaking, yes, but also, political parties used to be more about this. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know, the scandal of our time is who writes the laws.
Well, the Congress, and no, the lobbyists.
The lobbyists, right? So in other words, exactly. So, basically, like, the lobbyists write the laws and the representatives just pass them. Yep. And, so it's kind of like, okay, imagine if political parties were dedicated to educating the public about the laws and policies that they support.
That would be amazing, right?
That would be amazing. Well, guess what? A socialist party would, by its very nature, have to do that. That would be its basis as a political party, in a way that the capitalist parties are not based on that.
Right.
And in fact, it's in their interest to do the very opposite of that.
Right. Yeah.
To mystify, to demagogue.
You can make it seem very fancy to describe this. You can say, oh, we live in the society of the spectacle. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into representation. But I mean, really, what you're talking about is
the sad thing about DeBoard is that he witnessed the socialist and ostensibly Marxist parties doing the same thing as the capitalist parties, and then he thought that it was inherent in the party form itself. And it's like, but no, that's what happened in Stalinism.
Mm-hmm.
When these became the official parties of states that had interests, but when these parties were revolutionary, their whole reason for being was about educating the working class about how society works, and because the understanding was they needed to do that to justify their existence as opposed to the capitalist parties, but also because that's how they understood socialism to come about, meaning the working class would have to actually make socialism happen. It couldn't be done by some experts.
Right.
But with the bureaucratization of the Soviet Union and these parties, then it took on the same dynamic as the capitalist parties, which is you're only educating the public insofar as you need them to support you, but you're not educating them so they themselves can change society.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. So on Trump, back to Trump, we kind of went a meandering way, but
it's interesting, right? Because it's
very interesting.
It's in the absence of that, this is what we get.
Right. But I feel like our task as would-be Marxists, you are the last one. I'm a wannabe Marxist. That's how I think of myself. To try to understand this moment and make it as clear as we can to ourselves, to each other, and to whoever's watching and
Yeah.
help. So here's my question about all of this. Okay, so Trump did come in as a demagogue, you said.
Yes.
He did not really help people understand the situation more thoroughly. He didn't educate his voters. He came in and spoke to their emotions and blamed individuals and called people names and got elected that way. And
justified the issues for sure.
Yeah, and
in his own way.
Yeah. But the truth is, the establishment, the good Democrats, the people on MSNBC, are no less guilty of demagoguing.
No, they're in
but
some ways more guilty.
Yeah, they'll say, listen, I can't tell you, you would never understand. Or what they'll say is, here's what it is, but the people who disagree with us would never understand.
Well, you know what they actually say, these MSNBC and CNN people, they will just say that's above my pay grade. Meaning that whole language, above my pay grade, when did that language enter into the political discourse?
I know, I don't know, but
it's with
no, it was before Trump. I remember early. Oh yeah, because I was interviewing academics, and I would start asking them about, okay, how do we create a new society? Can we really handle this on the level of culture alone, let's say, or do we need to change political economic terms of society? And I remember the first time I asked someone that in an interview, or not maybe the first time, but one of the times, this left-winger, it was in the Obama era, they said, that's above my pay grade.
Yeah, post-2008. So maybe we could put it in the post-2008 era, because I don't think that in the war on terror era, I don't think that was available as an out in public discourse.
Yeah, probably not. Right? But this person, it seemed kind of charming, but it was very frustrating to me, because I was like, if it's above your pay grade and you're an Ivy League professor, what about me who's asking the question? Am I really being an idiot for even asking that question? That's how I felt about it.
Right. No, I mean, there are people who are closer to, so we might think of, like, I don't know, Larry Summers or somebody like that, right? And we might think of this kind of like academia state axis. Not so much, right? So a lot of people from the state, from politics, do get cushy academic jobs in retirement, right? But is it really the case that what politicians do when they're elected to office is that they hire academics? No, not really. So generally speaking, the academics that they hire are the people who are only in academia because they came out of the corporate world to begin with, or came out of the bureaucracy to begin with, right? So it's not like, like leftist academics are not going to populate the cabinet of any U.S. president, because they
they might. If Bernie had gotten elected,
Bernie still would have had to have gotten some other people in there. I mean, he would have had, who knows? He probably would have had the same people as Biden, the second string Obama people.
You think? I thought he was going to bring in some MMTers and all that. We have to talk about that in a second.
Yeah, we can talk about that in my other article. So, but getting back to it, so I always said this: Trump lies, but the people who accuse him of lying are lying to us worse, because they're basically saying, "Don't even go there. Nothing to see behind the curtain. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain," right? And so that's worse, meaning Trump is calling attention to things that, it's an index of the decadence of our ruling class, because it is pretty decadent, that they can't afford to really discuss much in public. They can't even go there. They can't allow the public to go there. And that's what I meant by above my pay grade, meaning that we should trust the experts. I mean, it's what we saw with COVID, but it's also what we saw. I always like to raise this. It's in one of my articles about Samantha Power. And, she was Obama's national security advisor when he was in his campaign. And then she said, when we came in, we wanted to make changes to U.S. foreign policy, but then we quickly learned that there's a wisdom in maintaining continuity in U.S. foreign policy. And so we abandoned the changes that we were trying to make for the better. And she said she was afraid that Trump and his people were not capable of learning that lesson. In other words, they were foolish enough to think, oh no, we're still going to try to make the changes we want to make. And what she meant by that was ending these wars. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what she meant, meaning the Obama people might have wanted to end these wars, but then they quickly found out from the experts that you can't. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay? And that's real. In other words, it's awful, but it's real. Meaning, maybe Trump was foolhardy to pull out of Afghanistan. And
well, it was Biden who did that, right?
Biden who did it, but Trump set it up, and Trump can only say, well, he would have done it differently. And maybe he would have, maybe he wouldn't have. And of course, my theory of Biden's removal of the troops from Afghanistan, I think he was sabotaged. Biden. Mm-hmm. I think he was resisted by the deep state, and then he insisted. So I defend Biden a lot of the time. He insisted, mm-hmm. and they were like, okay, we'll show you what it looks like. In other words, we're going to make it as fucked up as possible to punish you for insisting on something that we disagree with. That's what actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
It's grotesque. Again, we know this from the Vietnam era. Mm-hmm. The Vietnam War went on autopilot. And the Pentagon Papers, right? And then it's like, once set in motion, there's no way for us to get off this train. And then Nixon was like, we're definitely getting off this train.
Right.
I mean, he was, in 1968, Nixon was the peace candidate. To defend Nixon one more time.
You can't say that shit. What is wrong with you saying Nixon was a peace candidate?
Check it out.
Don't you remember?
Check it out. Gore Vidal, right, had a debate with William F. Buckley, and it's documented, and there's a movie called Best of Enemies or something. Mm-hmm. It's good. And basically, William F. Buckley was championing Ronald Reagan as a presidential candidate in 1968. Mm-hmm. And they were doing this debate at the RNC.
Yeah.
And Gore Vidal said, Nixon doesn't seem to represent anything at all. At least Reagan represents this conservative, he's got this ideological mission. Whereas Nixon represents nothing. He just seems to be a self-interested, power-hungry, narcissistic guy. And so I can at least give you credit, William F. Buckley, for supporting Ronald Reagan, because you're supporting someone who stands for something. Nixon doesn't stand for anything but himself. Mm-hmm. Now, Vidal was wrong about that. Nixon did represent something, right? Yeah. He represented, we're going to break the Cold War dynamic. We're going to get out of Vietnam. We're going to play China off of the Soviet Union, and we're going to establish world peace that way. We're going to step back from the brink. We're going to do détente with the Soviet Union. What the Democrats couldn't do.
Right.
So Trump is very much a Nixonian figure. Very much a Nixonian figure, as well as a Ronald Reagan kind of figure. He's both. And this is what confuses people. And, even Reagan, ended the Cold War. Nixon ended the Vietnam War. Reagan ended the Cold War. And he really did, meaning he made a peace initiative.
Oh, okay.
The Soviet Union. I mean, that is.
But, leftists said, Gorbachev did that.
Yeah, well, Gorbachev, it's a question of whether, because even before Gorbachev, there were moves in that direction in the Soviet leadership.
Right.
Right. And so would a second Carter administration with Brzezinski as national security advisor
No.
Would they have been able to?
No.
Would a Hubert Humphrey presidency have been able to pull out of Vietnam? No.
Yeah.
Right? So only Nixon could go to China, right?
Yeah.
And this is the thing. So, but again, the deep state. And, the right wing is crazy about this, but they're also right about it, which is that the deep state is Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been that way since FDR, basically. It's been that way since World War II. The U.S. did run on a World War II state for a long time. JFK got into trouble going against Dulles. Against Dulles.
So
Democrat.
I heard something about that.
Democrat.
Yeah.
Right? And they tried to fuck him with the Bay of Pigs thing.
Yeah, and then something else happened. I can't remember.
And then something else happened, right? And I think that Dulles actually said something really evil about JFK after he was assassinated. He said something like, "Oh yeah, JFK thought he was so smart." Ha ha ha.
God.
Yeah.
So okay, this is the final question on Trump. I mean, we're going to have to come back to this, but
when we look back in retrospect, history will remember Trump very differently than we're apt to see it now.
Right. Although, look,
I'm writing for that. I'm writing for that.
I think right now it's very striking to me how in some ways.
I don't want to be Gore Vidal.
No, I think that this year, though, this election, Trump is running differently than he did in 2016 and 2020. That the left, the Marxist left, say, or the socialist left, or the Bernie Sanders left, sees him differently than they did before. But they also sort of just don't see him at all anymore.
They don't see him at all, and they don't really see what's going on. I mean, I think that, the lawfare point is important because it has to do with long-term consequences of things that are being done under the logic of emergency measures, right? So even this crazy, like, $500 million penalty against Trump in the civil case brought by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, that the governor of New York had to say, she had to come out and say, businesses, we wouldn't do this to any other business.
Yeah.
And of course, the business people are like, but how do we know that? In other words, you say that now, but what is the next governor going to say? What's the next attorney general going to say? And Trump himself, when he got a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court on the 14th Amendment, he said, look, this isn't about me, it's about the presidency itself. And that's true, right? But the Democrats will tell you, oh no, it's just about him. And it's like, no. And again, even if it is just about him, what does he represent? Why is he such a threat? Really, why is he such a threat? Because it's absurd to think of him as a threat. He's not a threat. He's not a threat to capitalism. He's not a threat to the state. He's not a threat. Or the system can't tolerate even a slight threat. And what is the significance of that? Right? So the left will run around and say, oh, fascism and this and that. And no. None of that's going to happen. I mean, I was remembering my old comrades, the Spartacus League. They said that Ronald Reagan was getting ready to put people in concentration camps because he had changed the mandate of FEMA. And that he was prepared to lock up all the leftists and, hundreds of thousands of protesters ahead of invading Central America. And that therefore, we're on the brink of fascism. Children, no. No. We're not on the brink of fascism. We really, really, really are not, right? Unless everything is fascism. And so, again, it's going to sound like there's a movie Vice that I don't like that's about Dick Cheney. That's about this, how he comes out of the Ford administration and this unitary executive theory posse, right? That's trying to claw back on the Nixon Watergate reforms that were implemented. And, it turns them into these dark figures who have been trying to establish this dictatorial executive from way back when. They're Nixonites who are just bitter and on this lifelong quest to give the presidency back the powers that Nixon had.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have to think, well, where did those powers come from? Like constitutionally, what's the rationale? But also in capitalism, what do they represent? And if the president has been stripped of these powers, that doesn't mean that the state has been stripped of these powers. The state has retained them, and so all that was gotten rid of was civilian authority over the state.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
That's really the point.
So here's my question for you. And I'm going to put it in this way. Just the other day, I read, like yesterday, there was an article in the New York Times. It was about the problem of disinformation. Apparently, this time around, the Chinese are campaigning for Trump as well as the Russians. There's Chinese disinformation online. They have a very elaborate system, and it's called. There's a Chinese organization called Spamiflage. And so I read the article, and I started looking.
You can't make this shit up, can you? This goes way beyond any dystopian novel, doesn't it?
Yes, Spamiflage, by the way, it's not the same as Spam-A-Lot, which is a musical about Spamiflage, Chinese disinformation agents. So I look into it, and I say, okay, well, who are they reporting on? Well, they're reporting on these nonprofit groups and intelligence agencies, and really, which are the same thing. So they're really just reporting from the intelligence community. But if you look into like when these different organizations were formed, one of them was formed very early on after 9/11. Another one was formed to combat ISIS. These are organizations that are military, intelligence organizations aimed at countering recruitment efforts from ISIS, as an example, right? Now they're aimed inward at the domestic population from basically to protect the domestic population from itself. And you can know that because the kinds of stories they make up about disinformation agents are exposed. Like Hamilton 68, they discovered that the Russian bots were actually American citizens most of the time, and for instance, and now not right. So like we know all this, but the New York Times is reporting as if the Twitter files had never been released.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I look at this and I say, okay, you can see this story here, in the disinformation the intelligence community is putting forward of the tightening of control of civil society, including now the New York Times. I mean, I'm sure the New York Times is always an establishment mouthpiece, but this is pretty ridiculous, right? I mean, it is what it's claiming to try to combat. And I wonder if in the context of we have to have continuity in government, we have to have continuity in foreign policy. We learned that we can't change things. But if that's what we're experiencing now from the Democrats, and it had been in the Republican Party as well before in the war on terror,
of course,
is an intensification of something that's been around since, let's say, World War II. The Cold War morphed as a war on civil society. So in what case are we not facing fascism in some form or another?
Well, that's the point, right? So I indeed, and so I've been walking around, saying privately to people that this threat of the Republican Party bringing about fascism has been there for decades. But what if it turns out that the fascism is actually implemented by the Democrats? Right? But it's like the soft fascism. Well, then it's kind of like, then it's been around for a while. Right?
Only Nixon can go to China.
Right.
And only Bill Clinton can implement fascism in America. Or something like only Obama can implement fascism in America.
And, so it's done. And, this is why the right will also turn to things like Woodrow Wilson, which I do think is salutary. I mean, basically, I just want to say this because this is really important, that I'm seen as like a Trumpist or defending Trump or this or that. No, right? What I want the Trump moment to be, because it's an inevitable moment. Doesn't matter what we might want, what we might wish. I have to try to make it into a teachable moment, because I was miseducated about Reagan and Reaganism by the left. And I think that will be the way that we postpone the struggle for socialism for another generation, by miseducating young people about Trump now. And I do not want to be part of that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's my basic point, is we can't use Trump as an excuse to put off the necessary steps.
Education. Yeah.
And just at a very basic level, education. And so I feel like I'm not defending Trump, I'm defending reality. And reality is uncomfortable. And, you know, it's disturbing. And nonetheless, right, we do have to, however we can, we have to try to glean. We have to watch, we have to look at the cracks, the seams that are showing, and the mechanisms that are revealed in this process. You know, and also, you know, how this reversal of means and ends has come about. So how the constitutional separation of powers, checks and balances, has been deformed into this other thing for maintaining capitalism. And generally the left, you know, is like, oh, well, the American constitutional system, it's all about defending private property. It has been that way from the beginning. Yeah, I can see how it can look that way, but actually this was not what was intended. Right? It was not like, oh, the founding fathers were trying to set up this system for maintaining capitalism. No, definitely not. It became that 100 years after the American Revolution, in the advanced capitalist era, with the industrialization of the United States, it became something else, even though nominally it's supposed to be the constitutional order. But in practice, and this is why I always point out with Woodrow Wilson, he basically said, look, we're not doing the US Constitution anymore. We're not able to. We have to pay lip service to it. We have to pretend that that's what we're doing, but in reality, it's not what we're doing. And, you know, he's very straightforward about it. You know, he was a political science guy, political history guy. He was an academic, right? He studied the Prussian Empire. He studied Bismarckian Germany. He said, oh, they seem to have figured some things out that we have to figure out over here. Yeah. Bonapartism would call it. That's what the Marxists would call it. Like, you know, the U.S. has to get hip to this new need, right? And they did, you know, out of necessity. And it took some time. So, you know, Wilson announced this, and then he implemented some of it. Theodore Roosevelt proposed some things, and you get a kind of hybrid of the Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson plan in FDR. And that's the state we've been living under. We've been living under the New Deal, FDR, Democratic Party state. And as changed, the last time it went through a major change was the 60s, was LBJ, was the Great Society. And again, Nixon furthered that, he did. And in some ways, Reagan furthered it. Like we tend to think, oh, Reagan reversed it. Well, no. He modified it in furtherance of it.
Right.
And that's, you know, again, we tend to adopt a kind of progressive Democratic Party narrative regarding neoliberalism. It's wrong. Like it's a deception. It's a lie, right? And then the left has contributed to that lie, right? So the Democrats have lied to us. That's to be expected. The left has also gone along with that lie about the nature of the world that we live in.
Okay, one last comment, and then we should go to the Milton Friedman room, which is what people will probably get in the parrot room. But here it is. And just another kind of news item
Mm-hmm.
There's something called the Transition Integrity Project, TIP, and it was put together by the Democrats and the intelligence community, I believe, to in ahead of the 2020 election, and they ran wargaming kind of scenarios as to what would happen if Trump won, but didn't win with a solid win, but he won or skated in or tried to hold on to power. And everything that they accused Trump of doing and that Trump did try to do up into the insurrection is something they wargamed out.
Themselves, that they considered doing.
Yeah, that they were planning on, that they wargamed out, that they this was how the different levels of the strategy that they would implement. They ran 4 different scenarios, and by the time you get through all 4, everything that they accused Trump of trying to do, they had plans to do. Beyond that, the idea of sending fake electors in sort of already floated and
alternate electors. Right,
alternate
they're called disparagingly fake electors, but they're alternate electors. In other words, they're people who are ready to cast an electoral vote if the votes are tallied differently.
Right, and also there are other reasons why electors might, they be disloyal to the popular vote, or there's ways to make.
They called for that in 2016. I know that there was a lot of public discourse calling on the electors to vote their conscience and keep Trump from being elected.
There was calls for that in 2000 as well.
Sure.
And so there are various ways in which the electoral system can be played that are, I remember having an argument with Derek Varn in 2016 where I was saying, if he's a Russian agent, then it would be irresponsible to let him get into office. And the rules are,
would it?
Well, look, it was 2016. I had some derangement, but this is my side of the argument.
What I love now is what you're saying is he's a Putin NG agent, right? That he's both now, right?
Right.
That he's truly Manchurian candidate.
But I said, but look, the rules are electors can switch. This is not breaking the rules. That was the main point. Like, this is not illegal. This is how the game is played. He didn't win the popular vote, but he's getting in on the electoral college. Well, the electors can also switch, and so it's all legal, right? It would, right? And so,
they probably signed something.
No, yeah, they would have been fined.
They would have been, civilly, right?
Yeah. But the point is, everything that I was willing to possibly entertain in 2016 is everything that Trump was willing to entertain in 2020. And
perhaps, if it's even true that he was.
Right. But that's what he's accused of being.
Right.
Okay. So let's just sit with, I'm willing to go that far, and let's just sit with that. We have 2 candidates that have demonstrated their willingness to cheat in the election, and to cheat in ways that would be very disruptive to the political system. And we should expect that that's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.
No matter what.
It's going to intensify. That's right. And if Trump wins the Electoral College, which is what he has to win, I think even if he were to win the popular vote, as well as the Electoral College, the Democrats are going to try to keep him from taking office.
Right. I think that's right. And
they have the deep state on their side with that.
Yeah, and they're going to use his convictions.
Yep, they're going to use this stuff. That's right. And they're even saying now that the immunity case that's before the Supreme Court, they're saying that the Supreme Court, the conservative majority, is delaying their decision to help Trump avoid conviction before the election. I don't think they're doing that at all. I think they're delaying it because this is actually a monumental decision on their part. And I think they haven't figured out actually what their decision is, right? Because they can't say, a president can be tried like anyone else. They can't, actually. So they are gonna decide some immunity of some kind. They're gonna try to split the baby on that one. Right? And I think they're gonna have a very difficult time doing it. And that's why it's gonna be a much longer case.
I guess the best thing that can come out of this is if we pay close attention, we're going to see where the bodies are buried and how fucked up the system really is.
Yes.
You know?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And which is, demoralizing, I guess. But it's also, it's real,
Right.
And I just feel like, I mean, again, we're way down the road of the left being about emotions and morality. I think our last episode, I just said, look, from a Marxist perspective, it's not really about morality or principle. It's about an objective historical process. And of course, that can go any number of ways. In other words, that's what causes people to support Hamas. Is that they just see it as an objective historical process. And, there's a point to that. I get it. I understand, but it's also, by the way, what caused people on the left, Marxists, to support Hitler. Because they did, right? Because they were like, no, this is just the unfolding of an objective crisis of capitalism, and it has to play out. No, not exactly, because there are politically contingent things. There are. And they enter into the objective historical process. So I'm not going to say, I don't know, Biden or Trump. One is going to be a fulfillment of historical necessity. The other is going to be an accident.
No.
Right. It's not like that. Either way, right? And we tend to rationalize things psychologically. So the left is also very psychological, very impressionistic, which is that we give reasons for things ex post facto that they don't have necessarily. But this is why we have to do this very complicated thing of paying attention to what people claim to be doing, say that they're doing, seem to think that they're doing, and try to relate that to reality, right? Rather than just saying, oh no, so, I subjected myself to reading Trump's books, Art of the Deal, and How to Make America Great Again, and these kinds of things, and why I watch his speeches and his interviews, because, it helps to know what he thinks he's doing. Not because, he's some insightful person, but because that's why people are supporting him, actually. Right? So when the left doesn't pay attention to that, they really lose sight of why. I told my social workers last night, I was teaching my social workers, and we were talking about generational trauma. And I said, actually, the most reliable indicator of which counties would vote for Trump were veterans of the War on Terror. And not out of patriotism, but out of war fatigue and trauma. But the left never talks about that. Ever. At all. Never. And so, and he did run on that. He ran on that and he won on that. And yet nobody talks about that. Right? Instead, it's turned into, oh, he's an agent of Vladimir Putin. That's why he wanted to end the wars. It's unbelievable. The lies are amazing. It's like, in other words, look, the deep state.
They're now saying that if I go online and say we should get out of Ukraine, we should stop funding Ukraine, or the Israeli state is evil and we need to stop sending them money, I'm probably a Chinese agent.
Sure.
Or a dupe of Chinese agents. And
you're an agent of Eurasia against Oceania.
That's right. And they're tracking disinformation based on the content. Based on what they have a qualitative analysis. That's how they track it. It's if you say the wrong things, it's really frightening. And so no, I feel like we're in a very bad spot, and we should recognize that if they can use lawfare on the president, the former president, they can certainly use it on us, and they already have. They actually
Well, that's
already have.
definitely true. That's definitely true. So we should pay attention to that, but we should also, I think that we should think about, like, again, why the threat of Trump is so exaggerated. Because it's extremely exaggerated. In other words, he doesn't represent such a, because the right, I guess the Trump supporters think that he represents some like urgently needed policy changes that he really doesn't. And the left just sees that negatively, right? Whereas the Trump supporters see it positively. And it's like, actually, it's pretty slight. It doesn't say that it doesn't matter, right? It might matter in some way. But, what I was going to say is, the deep state might have been right, that we needed to keep these forever wars going. Right? I think
seems very, very dangerous. Just from a practical perspective,
sure.
It seems extremely dangerous.
It is. It's a problem, but I want to say that, let's say the war-fatigued veterans, the war-traumatized veterans had not turned out to vote for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Then the deep state would have gotten its way, in the primaries and in the general election. Let's say they didn't nominate Trump and they didn't vote him into office. And by the way, a lot of the Bernie supporters also came out of war fatigue, right? So we tend to think, oh, it's Medicare for all. No, a large part of Bernie's appeal was he was an anti-war candidate. He was a lifelong critic of American foreign policy, and that's why people trusted him on that.
Mm-hmm.
More than they trusted him on the Medicare for all stuff, because who the hell knows what that is and how you implement that and whether that can be done. And can the president do that? No. But the president can end the wars.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the continuity between Bernie and Trump, and that's also that's the real reason why the deep state.
Right.
That's the real reason.
Right. But is that, well, I'm going to put one more thing to you, then we should really go to the Milton Friedman thing. But last week, I'm starting another series of videos on Fridays. So it'd be now going between you and Fabio Vihi. And we'll see how Fabio Vihi does in that time slot. I feel like a network executive. But Fabio talks about the wars as having been and the COVID policies as having basically been a response to the underlying economic political conditions that were set up ahead of time. So not on purpose, but they were emerging. And I'll point to the fact that there was a need for massive quantitative easing or a massive infusion of cash into the economy in 2019, and that the lockdowns and the COVID crisis provided an excuse to do exactly what most of the elites were wanting to do already. Do you think that the continuation of the wars has to do with what we're going to be talking about next, which is the changes in political economy and the move from Keynesian Fordism to neoliberal Reaganism, and now to whatever is coming next, that these things are connected to the
they are, of course.
Yeah.
They are, of course. The real question is, because there are two questions, right? So there's like so-called military Keynesianism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something. It is. However, I also think something else, which is the American Empire. And the Pax Americana, the world system. And, so what have we seen in the post-Soviet world, right? That was supposed to bring about peace. Well, it did kind of bring about peace, which is that you don't have war between major powers. You just have local wars. And that seems to be changing now, but, maybe with Ukraine or something, maybe. But really, what we have to think about is, why is the world falling apart? Because the world is falling apart, right? Like if you look at the Arab Spring, if you look at the Syrian and Libyan civil wars, if you look at Iraq was going to collapse. I stand by that idea, which is that Saddam Hussein was not going to last anyway. Like his sons who like to, I don't know, make tigers eat like athletes who didn't perform well on the soccer field. This is not going to last. Sorry, no, it's not going to last. You know, Kurdistan was already basically autonomous. They had lost territorial sovereignty in Iraq already. So it was going down. So what does the collapse of these kinds of countries mean? You know, there's a crisis in Pakistan now, a deep political crisis in Pakistan. And so what does it mean? It means that, you know, there is a kind of crisis of the global order, and that is economic, because the economic crisis of 2008 hit the periphery, we might say. It hit the poor countries a lot harder. And generally, we could say structural changes in world capitalism generally impact the poorer countries much more drastically, much more immediately. You know, like the migrant crisis in the United States. Like, why is there this huge influx? First, it was the triangle of Central American countries who are basically, it's middle class coming to the United States because there's no economic opportunities. They can't survive, right? Venezuela, obviously, it's different. It's a political crisis. But also, you know, you could think about post-Chavez Venezuela, why is it going down? Right? So I think that the US is funded by the rest of the world. It is, to keep order in the world. In other words, the US, why does the US have a larger military than the next 10 countries combined? You know, or that used to be the case anyway. But I think they spend...
I think it was like every other country combined, our military spending is bigger than the world.
Something like that. So the question is, well, why is that? Right? Is it US imperialism? Well, no. Why does US imperialism exist? Why does the world need it to exist? Because the world needs it to exist. You know, as far as Xi and Putin are concerned, they're not trying to replace the United States. They're trying to keep the US within bounds. In their perspective, play the role that it plays, but not cross certain bounds in doing that. And I know the Chinese Communist Party and I know Vladimir Putin both have this idea that the US is sucked into these things, that it can't help itself, but try to like police the entire world. And their attitude is, let us police our areas of the world.
Yeah.
Right? That's the basic thing that's going on. And so it's not really multipolarity. That whole idea is bunk. Because at the end of the day, Russia and China still prop up the US. They still need the US. So they need the US within bounds. So why I switch from the economic to the political is that the general economic situation, you know, Yanis Varoufakis has a book, The Global Minotaur. And he also has a take on the yuan replacing the dollar, right? That all that is a buffer for the dollar. In other words, it remains a global dollar economy and the yuan is just inserted as a buffer, so that it means China's accepting some of the risk of the global economy and is willing to absorb some of the shock in the system in order to protect the dollar, right? It's not about replacing the dollar. It's about propping it up. And this is what people don't understand, right? So why does the world need the US to play the role that it plays? Because it does. The whole world needs the US to play the role that it plays. And again, why does any country have to play this role? Capitalism. Right? I mean, and, you know, so, you know, it's a complicated thing, but I think that keeping our eye on the ball of politics is important. And not falling into like mystifications of geopolitics and like, I don't know, some clash of civilizations or something, you know. No, right? You know, Jacob Siegel is right. The US wants to make every country into a client. Well, guess what? Every country wants to be a client too. Right? So it's not just the US like strong-arming people into a clientele relationship. All these countries want to be US clients too. Now, the problem being that the clients have interests opposed to each other. They all want to be US clients, but they can't all equally be U.S. clients because they have conflicting interests against each other, and then the U.S. has to try to balance those. So you can imagine these technocrats, the blob, what are they managing? They're managing that. How do we keep all the clients from killing each other?
Right.
That's what it's really about. You know, it is Pax Americana, and it's ugly, but that's what it is. And the question is not, well, why did the U.S. impose this on the world? The U.S. didn't. Why did the world need this? Yeah.
Well, it had gone to war against itself.
Yeah, World War II. The world destroyed itself, and then was like, America, save us. I mean,
right.
Even the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Cold War the Soviet Union did not want the Cold War.
No. Well, listen, we'll do another episode about that. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.